In the deep, quiet lowcountry of South Carolina, a family of power and privilege held the law in their hands for generations. But behind the wealth and respect, secrets were rotting. One summer night, gunfire shattered the silence and exposed the unimaginable truth about the man everyone thought they knew. In the quiet, humid air of South Carolina's lowcountry, the Murdaugh family name had carried weight for nearly a century. They were a legal dynasty deeply rooted in the region's justice system. 3 generations of Murdaugh men had served as solicitors, the equivalent of district attorneys, across several counties. Their power reached into every corner of Hampton County. Judges knew them. Police respected them. Locals often said that if the Murdaughs wanted something to happen, it would. At the center of this powerful family was Richard Alexander Alex Murdaugh, a tall, red-haired attorney in his early 50s. He was a partner at a successful law firm in Hampton, and by all appearances, he had it all: a respected career, a loving family, and a comfortable life in the rural South. Alex's wife, Margaret Maggie Murdaugh, 52, was known in the community for her charm and warmth. She was social, polite, and active in her children's lives. They had 2 sons, Richard Alexander Jr., known as Buster, the elder in his mid-20s, and Paul, the younger, just 22. The family owned multiple properties, including a sprawling 1,700-acre estate called Moselle in Culleton County. The Moselle property was both a private getaway and a symbol of their wealth, a mix of hunting land, a farmhouse, and a set of kennels where the family kept their dogs. But beneath the surface of this respected Southern family, trouble was growing. By 2019, Paul Murdaugh had become a source of scandal. On a February night that year, Paul and several of his friends went boating after drinking. The night ended in tragedy when the boat crashed, throwing passengers into the cold water. 19-year-old Mallory Beach, one of Paul's friends, was killed. Her body was found a week later. Investigators said Paul was driving the boat under the influence, and he was later charged with boating under the influence causing death. The Murdaugh family's name began to appear in headlines, not for their achievements, but for their influence and the sense that Paul was being protected by his family's connections. The accident fractured the family's once polished image. Lawsuits followed, and the pressure mounted. Paul faced the possibility of prison time, and the family faced financial strain. Maggie was reportedly anxious about her son's case, and Alex's behavior grew more erratic. At the same time, his work at the law firm came under quiet scrutiny. Unknown to many, Alex had been living a double life, one filled with lies, debt, and theft. He had been stealing money from clients and his own firm for years, covering his tracks with falsified records. His addiction to painkillers only worsened his need for money. Though his colleagues began to suspect irregularities, his reputation as a Murdaugh shielded him for a long time. Then came June 7, 2021. That evening, at around 10 p.m., a call came into the Culleton County 911 dispatch. The caller was Alex Murdaugh. His voice was panicked, shaken. He told the operator he had just returned home to find his wife and son shot near the kennels on their Moselle property. Deputies arrived to a horrifying scene. Paul was found lying inside one of the kennels, shot twice with a shotgun. Maggie was nearby, shot multiple times with a high-powered rifle. The mother and son were dead. The once untouchable Murdaugh family was now at the center of a brutal double murder. In the days that followed, Alex portrayed himself as a grieving husband and father. He told investigators that after dinner that evening, he had gone to visit his elderly mother at her home in nearby Almeda. When he returned about an hour later, he said he found Maggie and Paul dead. The community rallied around him at first, offering sympathy. But as investigators began to dig deeper, questions emerged. There were inconsistencies in his story. Cell phone data and vehicle records didn't fully support his timeline. One detail stood out. Despite saying he hadn't been near the kennels before discovering the bodies, his voice was later identified on a video recorded at the kennels minutes before the murders. That video came from Paul's phone. It was recorded at 8:44 p.m. and showed Paul trying to capture a video of a friend's dog. In the background, two other voices could be heard, his mother, Maggie, and unmistakably, his father, Alex. The discovery of that clip would later become the case's most crucial piece of evidence. But in June 2021, investigators were still trying to piece together what had happened. No arrests were made, and for months, rumors filled the small towns of the Lowcountry. Some whispered that the killings were revenge for Paul's boating case. Others speculated it was tied to Alex's work. Few imagined the truth, that the killer might be one of their own. As summer turned to fall, the walls around Alex Murdaugh began to close in. In September 2021, his colleagues at the law firm confronted him about missing funds. Millions of dollars had vanished from settlements and client accounts. When confronted, Alex resigned. The next day, another shocking event took place. On September 4th, Alex called 911 again, claiming he had been shot in the head while changing a tire on a rural road. He survived the shooting with only a minor wound, and the story quickly drew national attention. But as investigators looked into the incident, the truth emerged. Alex had arranged his own shooting. The shooter was Curtis Edward Eddie Smith, a man Alex knew through his work and opioid use. Alex had reportedly hired Smith to kill him so that Buster, his surviving son, could collect a $10 million life insurance payout. The staged shooting shattered any remaining sympathy for Alex. The story that had once seemed like a tragic family loss now looked like a tangled web of deceit. Investigators began examining every aspect of his life, his finances, his work, and his connection to other mysterious deaths linked to the Murdaugh family. These included the 2015 death of Stephen Smith, a teenager found dead on a rural road with ties to the Murdaughs, and the 2018 death of Gloria Satterfield, the family's longtime housekeeper who had supposedly fallen down the stairs at Moselle. Her family later learned that Alex had stolen more than $4 million from a settlement intended for them. The once powerful lawyer was unraveling before the public's eyes. His influence could no longer protect him. Reporters flooded Hampton County. The Murdaugh name, once spoken with respect, now stood for corruption, scandal, and betrayal. Every secret that Alex had buried was coming to light. Yet through it all, he denied any involvement in the murders of Maggie and Paul. He claimed to love them, saying he would never harm his family. But investigators were building a case that told a different story, one of desperation and deceit, where murder was the ultimate act to cover a crumbling empire. By late 2021, Alex Murdaugh was facing a growing list of charges for financial crimes, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. But the most serious accusations were still to come. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies were quietly working to prove what they suspected, that Alex had killed his wife and son to buy time, to gain sympathy, and to distract from the financial ruin that was closing in. The illusion of the perfect Southern family had been destroyed. And soon, the truth about what really happened at Moselle on that dark June night would begin to surface, changing the Murdaugh legacy forever. By the end of 2021, Alex Murdaugh's world was collapsing piece by piece. The carefully built image of a respected attorney, husband, and father had turned into a nightmare of public disgrace. He was already under investigation for stealing from his law firm and clients, facing lawsuits, and being linked to multiple deaths. Still, the biggest question remained unanswered. Who killed Maggie and Paul Murdaugh? The investigation was slow and quiet, but every new discovery brought investigators closer to a man they had once treated as a victim. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, had been handling the double homicide from the start. They gathered evidence from the Moselle property: shell casings, tire tracks, gunshot residue, phone data, and surveillance footage. From the beginning, Alex's behavior on the night of June 7, 2021, drew suspicion. His call to 911 sounded panicked, but the way he described the scene raised questions. He said he had checked both bodies and tried to turn Paul over, yet there was little physical evidence to show that he had done that. Investigators noticed blood on his clothes, but not in a way that matched his story of finding his family and checking for signs of life. As weeks turned into months, the case remained unsolved publicly, but behind the scenes, agents were uncovering key inconsistencies. One of the first major clues came from cell phone data. Maggie's phone had been found later, discarded on a roadside not far from the property. Data from the phone, combined with Alex's vehicle records, showed that his story about when and where he had been that evening didn't quite line up. But the biggest piece of evidence was still hidden on Paul's phone. Paul's phone was recovered at the crime scene, but it took months to unlock and extract the data. When investigators finally did, they found a short video recorded just before the murders. The clip, taken at 8:44 p.m., was meant to show a friend's dog at the kennels. The camera wasn't focused on people, but voices could be heard in the background. Investigators identified them as belonging to Paul, Maggie, and Alex. This single moment destroyed Alex's alibi. He had told police that he hadn't been anywhere near the kennels before discovering the bodies later that night. Yet here was clear proof that he had been there minutes before the shootings. At the same time, financial investigators were uncovering a massive web of theft and deceit. Alex had embezzled millions from his law firm and clients over many years. He would settle large cases, then secretly divert the money to bank accounts he controlled. When the firm confronted him in September 2021, he could no longer hide it. His opioid addiction had spiraled out of control, and the pressure from lawsuits related to the 2019 boat crash was mounting. His financial crimes were on the verge of being exposed, and his reputation, his greatest asset, was falling apart. Prosecutors would later argue that this was his motive. Killing Maggie and Paul would buy him sympathy and time, distracting everyone from the truth about his finances. In the months following the murders, Alex's life unraveled even further. After staging his own shooting on a roadside in September 2021, investigators learned that he had asked Curtis Eddie Smith, a man he had helped legally in the past and who sometimes provided him with drugs, to shoot him so his son Buster could receive a life insurance payout. When that plan failed and police discovered the setup, Alex was arrested for insurance fraud. The once powerful lawyer was now being portrayed as a conman and manipulator. Meanwhile, the community watched in disbelief as each revelation emerged. The Murdaugh name had been a symbol of authority for generations, and now it represented corruption and greed. Reporters flooded into Hampton and Culleton counties, covering every twist in the story. Residents who once feared or respected the Murdaughs now openly criticized them. The Lowcountry had become the setting for a modern Southern tragedy, a tale of privilege, power, and downfall. By early 2022, multiple investigations were running at once. SLED was focusing on the murders, while state prosecutors handled financial crimes. The Beach family continued their lawsuit over the boat crash that killed Mallory Beach. And investigators had reopened the cases of Stephen Smith, the teenager found dead on a rural road in 2015, and Gloria Satterfield, the Murdaugh's housekeeper who had supposedly fallen on their property in 2018. Each of these cases now seemed connected by a single thread: Alex Murdaugh. Through all this, Alex maintained that he had nothing to do with Maggie and Paul's deaths. He appeared emotional in interviews, crying and expressing his grief. His surviving son, Buster, stayed mostly out of the spotlight but supported his father publicly. Yet even his allies began to distance themselves. His former law firm removed his name, his law license was suspended, and his wealth was gone. Still, law enforcement remained silent on the murder charges. That silence only fueled speculation. Then, in July 2022, more than a year after the murders, SLED announced that Alex Murdaugh had been indicted for the killings of his wife and son. The indictment stated that he had used two different weapons, a shotgun and a rifle, to carry out the murders, and that his motive was to distract from his financial misconduct. He pleaded not guilty. The arrest marked a turning point in one of the most closely watched criminal cases in modern South Carolina history. The lead-up to the trial captured national attention. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and news outlets dissected every detail. People wanted to know how a man from one of the state's most powerful families could fall so far. Prosecutors began to outline their case, revealing evidence that painted Alex as a man cornered by his own lies. They pointed to the cell phone video, his inconsistent statements, and his financial desperation. They also uncovered a pattern of manipulation. Alex had repeatedly lied to his clients, his colleagues, and even his family. As the legal process moved forward, the public learned more about Alex's financial schemes. He had stolen money from a trust meant for the sons of his late housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield. He had redirected settlement checks meant for accident victims. He even used fake bank accounts to disguise the theft. Investigators estimated that he had taken over $8 million. For years, his charm and reputation had allowed him to get away with it. But now, with his crimes exposed, his world was collapsing. In the courtroom and in the media, Alex's story shifted from tragedy to exposure. He was no longer the grieving father. He was the accused murderer, the man whose empire was built on deception. The public watched as prosecutors detailed how he had allegedly used his family's deaths to create a smokescreen, hoping investigators and reporters would focus on the murders rather than his financial crimes. For a while, it worked. After the murders, sympathy had poured in. People had stopped asking about the missing money. But that sympathy faded quickly once the lies came out. As 2022 ended, preparations for the trial intensified. The prosecution collected over 800 pieces of evidence and interviewed dozens of witnesses. They built a timeline based on phone data, car GPS records, and testimony from law enforcement. The defense, led by seasoned attorneys, planned to argue that the state had no direct evidence tying Alex to the murders. No eyewitnesses, no confession, and no murder weapon had been found. They would portray him as a flawed man who had made terrible mistakes, but was still innocent of killing his family. The case was more than a criminal trial. It was a reckoning for a region that had long lived under the shadow of the Murdaugh name. For years, people whispered about their power, their connections, and the way justice seemed to bend around them. Now, the same system that had once protected Alex would be the one to judge him. The family legacy that began with law and order had ended in suspicion and bloodshed. As the trial approached, attention turned back to the night of June 7, 2021. What really happened between the moment the video on Paul's phone was recorded and the moment Alex called 911? Why had Maggie and Paul been targeted? Prosecutors believed the answers lay in the crumbling facade of Alex's life. His money was gone. His firm was closing in. The boat crash case threatened to expose everything. They argued that in his desperation he saw only one way out, to eliminate the two people closest to him, to appear as the victim rather than the villain. By January 2023, the stage was set. The double murder trial of Alex Murdaugh began in a packed courtroom in Walterboro, South Carolina. For 6 weeks, the state and defense presented their arguments, and the nation watched. Every word, every photograph, every timeline was analyzed. Behind the legal strategies and courtroom tension was a story that reached far beyond one family. It was about wealth, power, addiction, and the dangerous illusion of control. And in the final part of this story, the truth about Alex Murdaugh's actions and his fate would finally come to light. The trial of Alex Murdaugh began in January 2023 in Walterboro, South Carolina, and quickly became one of the most closely watched courtroom dramas in America. For 6 weeks, the world listened to a story that mixed wealth, corruption, addiction, and murder. The courtroom was filled every day with reporters, locals, and curious spectators. Some came out of fascination, others out of disbelief that a man from one of South Carolina's most powerful legal families could be sitting at the defendant's table, accused of murdering his own wife and son. The prosecution presented a clear and methodical case. They said Alex Murdaugh killed Maggie and Paul on June 7, 2021, to distract everyone from his financial crimes that were about to come to light. They described him as a man cornered by his own lies, someone who was about to lose everything: his career, his family's legacy, and his reputation. The prosecutors argued that the murders were not a spontaneous act of rage, but a calculated move by a desperate man. The jury heard about Alex's years of theft, his opioid addiction, and the pressures closing in on him from lawsuits, debt, and exposure. The prosecutors said he believed that the sympathy from losing his family might buy him time and shift public focus away from his financial fraud. They then turned to the evidence. The video from Paul's phone, recorded at the kennels minutes before the murders, was the turning point of the case. The state called multiple witnesses to confirm that the voices in the background belonged to Paul, Maggie, and Alex. This directly contradicted Alex's claim that he hadn't been near the kennels that evening. Cell phone data, GPS from his car, and steps recorded on his phone all pointed to the fact that he was moving around the property during the time of the murders, not away at his mother's house, as he had said. The prosecution also presented evidence of gunshot residue found on Alex's hands, clothing, and car. They admitted that the murder weapons had never been recovered, but they noted that similar guns were owned by the family. Shell casings found near Maggie's body matched ammunition used in one of Alex's rifles. Prosecutors argued that after the killings, Alex changed clothes, disposed of the weapons, and then drove to his mother's house to create an alibi before calling 911. The defense countered with their own narrative. They portrayed Alex as a flawed man but not a killer. They said the investigation was sloppy, that police had made up their minds too early, and that the evidence was circumstantial. They emphasized that there were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA linking Alex directly to the murders. They reminded the jury that Alex had lost his wife and son and was now being punished again for the same tragedy. They also pointed out that SLED had not found any blood in Alex's car or at his mother's home, which they argued made it impossible for him to have committed such a brutal crime without leaving more evidence behind. Then came Alex's own testimony, a risky move that surprised many. Taking the stand, he faced the jury directly and admitted to lying about being at the kennels that night. He said he had lied because of his addiction to painkillers, his paranoia, and his distrust of law enforcement. He tearfully told the court that he loved Maggie and Paul and would never harm them. His confession to lying was meant to appear as honesty, but for many, it only deepened the sense that he was manipulating the truth once again. Prosecutors seized on this moment, pointing out that his willingness to lie to police on such a critical detail showed exactly what kind of man he was, a man capable of deceit at the highest level when it served his needs. Over 6 weeks, the jury heard testimony from more than 70 witnesses. Financial experts detailed how Alex had stolen millions. Friends described how the family's image had been shattered by Paul's boating accident. Law enforcement officers walked through the forensic evidence. Each new detail painted a picture of a man whose life was built on lies that finally caught up to him. When closing arguments came, the prosecution told the jury that the evidence formed a single, consistent story. Alex Murdaugh murdered his wife and son to save himself. They described him as a man so used to control that when his empire began to fall apart, he made the ultimate decision: to kill those closest to him for his own survival. The defense asked the jury to consider whether they truly believed that a father could commit such a brutal act, reminding them that the state's case was built on assumptions, not direct proof. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty on both counts of murder and guilty on 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. Alex Murdaugh showed little reaction as the words were read aloud. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the verdict being recorded. The next day, Judge Clifton Newman sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called Murdaugh's crimes staggering and said that his fall from grace was unlike anything he had ever seen. The conviction marked the end of a Southern dynasty that had shaped local justice for nearly a century. Alex Murdaugh, once one of its proudest sons, was now its most infamous figure. After the trial, prosecutors continued to pursue charges for his financial crimes, and he still faced dozens of indictments related to fraud, theft, and conspiracy. But for many, the double murder conviction closed the chapter on the most shocking part of his story. The case left behind a haunting legacy. It revealed how power and privilege could create a shield strong enough to hide corruption for years. It showed how addiction and greed could twist a man's sense of right and wrong. And it reminded the public that even in small towns, behind the charm and tradition, darkness can live undetected for generations. The Murdaugh murders became more than a crime story. They became a symbol of how unchecked influence and moral decay can destroy everything, even family. The Moselle property, once a sign of wealth and pride, now stood empty and silent, a reminder of a legacy built on lies and ended in tragedy. A respected Georgia attorney, a wealthy wife, and a single gunshot inside a moving SUV. What looked like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a courtroom mystery. Was it fear, negligence, or something darker? The truth behind Tex McIver's calm voice would leave a state questioning everything it believed. It began like a story that could have come from anywhere in the American South. An old, respected attorney, his successful wife, and a night that would end in tragedy on the dark roads of Atlanta. Tex McIver wasn't just any man in Georgia. Claude Tex McIver III was a well-known labor and employment attorney, a fixture in Atlanta's legal world, and someone who had built a long career based on authority and respect. His wife, Diane McIver, was just as accomplished, serving as president of U.S. Enterprises Incorporated, a family-owned business empire in Atlanta. They were the kind of couple people admired, well-dressed, polished, comfortable in elite social circles, and often seen together at charity events and high-profile gatherings. In September 2016, they had been married for more than a decade. Diane, in her early 60s, was known for her intelligence and independence. She managed her own fortune and was said to be the stronger personality in the marriage, sharp, organized, and confident. Tex, who was in his 70s, carried himself with Southern charm, often referring to his wife as the love of his life. To friends and colleagues, they seemed like a couple who had built a steady life together, splitting their time between their city home in Buckhead and their 85-acre ranch in Putnam County, Georgia. That weekend, the McIvers invited their close friend Danny Jo Carter to the ranch. Danny Jo, a middle-aged businesswoman and longtime friend of Diane's, often spent weekends with the couple. She was comfortable around them, someone both trusted. The three spent the weekend enjoying country life, horseback riding, outdoor dinners, and easy conversation. But when Sunday arrived, their quiet weekend took a fatal turn. That Sunday evening, September 25, 2016, the trio decided to return to Atlanta. Diane sat in the front passenger seat of her white Ford Expedition. Danny Jo was behind the wheel, and Tex sat in the back seat behind Diane. The drive from Putnam County to Atlanta took about 2 hours. They chatted casually for most of the trip. It was already dark when they reached the edge of the city. At some point, they exited the interstate onto the streets of downtown Atlanta. According to later testimony, this detour made Tex uneasy. He told the women they had taken a wrong exit and were entering what he described as a rough neighborhood. He asked Diane to hand him his revolver from the console between the front seats. Diane reached into the compartment, retrieved the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, and passed it back to her husband. Tex took it and reportedly held it in his lap as the car continued toward Buckhead. Danny Jo drove calmly, later recalling that Tex seemed drowsy but not agitated. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. The bullet passed through the seat and struck Diane in the back. The car swerved briefly before Danny Jo realized what had happened. Diane gasped, clutching her chest. Panic filled the SUV. Danny Jo asked Tex what he had done, and he responded, "The gun just went off." They raced toward Emory University Hospital. Danny Jo kept calling out to Diane, who was still conscious but weakening quickly. Tex tried to reassure her, saying it was an accident. When they reached the hospital, doctors rushed Diane into emergency care, but the bullet had pierced major organs. Within minutes, she was dead. Tex later told police he had fallen asleep holding the gun and had discharged when the car hit a bump. To investigators, that explanation raised questions. Firearms experts said the revolver required deliberate pressure on the trigger. The gun couldn't have fired simply from being jostled. Still, Tex insisted the shooting was unintentional. He told officers he loved his wife deeply and was devastated by what had happened. At first, police treated the shooting as a tragic accident. The story of a gun going off seemed plausible enough to wait for further evidence. But as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. The night of the shooting, Tex asked Danny Joe not to tell anyone that he had requested the gun because he felt unsafe in that area. He also called friends to handle his affairs before he spoke to detectives. These details, while small, made investigators uneasy. As the days passed, the story became front-page news in Atlanta. The image of a respected attorney accidentally shooting his wife from the back seat of a car drew national attention. The case seemed strange, almost cinematic, a couple of wealth and status caught in a scandal that didn't fit their public image. Police wanted to understand motive, if there was one. They began looking into Tex's finances, marriage, and behavior after the shooting. Friends of the couple told reporters that Tex and Diane appeared happy, though some described tension beneath the surface. Diane was financially independent and had made it clear she managed her own wealth. She had updated her will several times, leaving assets to both Tex and charitable causes. Investigators discovered that Tex's own financial situation was not as strong as it appeared. He had lost his equity partnership in his law firm and relied heavily on Diane's income. Some prosecutors later argued this created a motive, though there was no clear evidence of any financial dispute between them that weekend. In the months following the shooting, Tex's behavior came under scrutiny. He sold some of Diane's belongings, made changes to the household staff, and seemed preoccupied with her estate. To outsiders, it looked like he was trying to manage the fallout, but to investigators, it felt suspicious. They believed the man, grieving publicly, was also taking steps to control her wealth privately. By the end of 2016, police had shifted their focus. What began as an accidental shooting was now a potential homicide investigation. Prosecutors started presenting evidence to a grand jury, reviewing ballistic tests, phone records, and statements from witnesses. Danny Joe Carter, the only other eyewitness, cooperated with authorities and gave multiple interviews. Her account never wavered. Tex had asked for the gun, and seconds later, it fired. In December 2016, Tex was charged with involuntary manslaughter. But within months, the charge escalated. Investigators claimed there were enough inconsistencies to suggest intent. By 2017, the case transformed from an accident into a murder trial. The prosecution alleged that Tex McIver had a financial motive to kill his wife and that the shooting was no accident at all. Tex's defense team pushed back hard. They described him as a man broken by grief, insisting there was no motive and no plan. His reputation as a disciplined, ethical lawyer, they said, made the idea of cold-blooded murder absurd. They pointed to his immediate call for help, his visible distress, and the presence of a close family friend in the car as proof that nothing was planned. The story began to divide public opinion. Some saw Tex as a tragic figure, a man whose life was ruined by a split-second mistake. Others viewed him as manipulative and arrogant, a wealthy attorney using his connections to escape responsibility. Reporters swarmed the courthouse each time he appeared, and television stations covered every detail. For months, the case built tension across Georgia. The friends of Diane testified about her marriage, painting a portrait of a couple whose lives revolved around appearances. They seemed close, but not intimate. Financial stress, though unconfirmed, was rumored. Investigators dug up text messages, bank statements, and testimony about Diane's estate. The deeper they went, the murkier the story became. By 2018, Tex McIver was finally set to stand trial for murder. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts, including malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and influencing witnesses. The defense continued to argue it was all a tragic accident. But as the jury prepared to hear opening statements, it was clear that this would not be a simple case. What had happened in that car was still unclear, but one thing was certain. The night Diane McIver died, a comfortable Southern marriage unraveled into one of the most controversial cases in Georgia's recent history. The courtroom would soon decide whether it was a mistake or murder. When the trial began in 2018, Atlanta's courthouse was packed. Reporters filled every seat, and television cameras lined the steps outside. Everyone wanted to see how a man like Tex McIver would defend himself against the charge of killing his wife. Inside the courtroom, the tone was tense but calm. The prosecution described the case as one of deception hidden behind charm. They said Tex wasn't the victim of bad luck or a sleeping accident, but a man who had carefully manipulated those around him after pulling the trigger. Tex McIver sat beside his lawyers, dressed in a suit and tie, his face still and composed. He was 75 then, older than most defendants in a murder case, but his mind remained sharp. His defense team began by telling the jury what they had been saying all along. This was an accident, nothing more. They explained that Tex often carried a gun for protection, especially when traveling through unfamiliar areas. He had a legal permit, and he had owned firearms for decades. They repeated his claim that he had been half asleep when the gun fired, and that it was impossible to believe he would intentionally shoot the woman he loved, especially in front of a witness. The prosecution countered with a different picture. They presented evidence that Tex's finances were in decline. He had recently lost his position as an equity partner at his law firm, meaning a sharp drop in income. Diane, by contrast, was thriving. Her company, U.S. Enterprises, was profitable, and she was known for being practical with money. The prosecutors told the jury that Tex depended on her financially. They suggested that he might have seen her death as a way to regain financial control. It was a theory built more on circumstances than direct proof, but it gave the jury something to think about. One of the key witnesses was Danny Jo Carter, the friend who had been driving the SUV that night. She spoke quietly, recalling every detail of that drive from the countryside into Atlanta. She said Tex had asked for his gun when they exited the interstate, claiming he was worried about crime in that part of town. She described handing the weapon to Diane, who then passed it back to Texas. A few minutes later, she heard the gunshot and Diane's voice saying, "Tex, you shot me." Danny Jo's account was steady, but emotional. She told the jury that she had no reason to believe Tex wanted to hurt his wife, but she also couldn't understand how the gun fired by accident. The prosecutors also brought in ballistic experts who testified that the revolver Tex used had a heavy trigger pull. It couldn't have gone off without deliberate pressure. One investigator described it as mechanically impossible for the gun to fire simply because the car hit a bump. That testimony hurt the defense's version of events. Other witnesses took the stand to speak about what happened after the shooting. One nurse testified that Tex seemed more concerned about his own situation than his wife's condition while at the hospital. Another friend said Tex asked her to keep quiet about him asking for the gun that night. Prosecutors said those actions showed guilt, not shock. The defense tried to repair his image by calling character witnesses. Colleagues described Tex as disciplined and law-abiding. Friends spoke about his deep affection for Diane. They emphasized that he was a man of faith, someone who had never been violent or aggressive. His lawyers argued that the physical evidence didn't prove intent, and that the state was trying to turn a terrible mistake into a crime. Throughout the trial, Tex himself stayed composed, taking notes, whispering occasionally to his attorneys. When he finally testified, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was calm, deliberate, and heavy with emotion. He said he was holding the revolver loosely in his lap, that he had been drifting in and out of sleep, and that the car's movement must have caused his finger to slip. He said he immediately realized what happened and shouted for Danny Jo to get to the hospital as fast as possible. He denied any financial motive or marital trouble, insisting that his life ended the moment Diane's did. Under cross-examination, prosecutors pressed him hard. They pointed out inconsistencies in his early statements, questioned why he had asked Danny Jo to stay silent about the gun, and challenged his claim about dozing off with a loaded weapon. Tex's answers stayed measured, but the tension in the courtroom was obvious. He repeated that it was an accident, but the prosecutor's questions planted doubt in the jury's mind. The trial stretched over weeks, with each side building its own version of the truth. The prosecution said Tex had both motive and opportunity, and that his calm behavior afterward showed calculation. The defense said he was being punished for being a wealthy man who made a foolish mistake. Public opinion outside the courtroom was divided. Some saw a man wrongly accused because of his status. Others saw privilege shielding guilt. When closing arguments came, the courtroom was packed again. The prosecutor walked the jury through the evidence, Tex's finances, his request for the gun, the physical impossibility of it firing on its own, and his conduct after the shooting. This was no accident, the prosecutor said. This was a man who made a choice. The defense countered that theory by appealing to reason. They said the state had no proof of intent, no eyewitness who saw anger or malice, and no evidence of planning. They reminded jurors that Danny Joe Carter, who knew the couple best, never said there was a fight, an argument, or even a tense moment before the shot. It was tragic, it was senseless, but it was not murder, his attorney said in closing. After long deliberations, the jury reached its verdict. Tex McIver was found not guilty of malice murder, but guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during a felony, and influencing a witness. The decision stunned the courtroom. Tex stood silently, his face pale. His lawyers looked shaken. His supporters were in tears. The prosecution had succeeded in convincing the jury that while he might not have planned to kill his wife, his actions were criminally reckless enough to count as murder under Georgia law. The judge sentenced him to life in prison for felony murder, along with additional time for the firearm and witness charges. At his age, it seemed like a death sentence. His defense team promised to appeal immediately, saying the jury had been misled by complex instructions and that the evidence did not meet the standard for murder. As Tex was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the story felt like it had reached its end. But the case was far from over. Behind the scenes, his attorneys were already preparing for another fight, one that would eventually change the course of everything that followed. When Tex McIver entered prison, he was in his late 70s, and many believed he would never walk free again. The life sentence for felony murder meant he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, unless his appeal changed everything. For a man who had once been a respected attorney, admired for his calm intelligence, the fall was steep. Inside the prison system, he was simply another inmate with a number. But his defense team never gave up. They believed the trial had been flawed, that the jury was not given the full range of choices it should have had. Specifically, they argued that the judge had refused to instruct the jury on the lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter, a key point that could have changed the verdict entirely. For months, they worked on the appeal, combing through the trial record, witness testimony, and jury instructions. The appeal eventually reached the Georgia Supreme Court in 2022. The defense argued that there had been enough evidence presented to justify an involuntary manslaughter option because Tex had maintained all along that the shooting was accidental. If the jury had been given the choice to convict on that lesser offense, they said it might not have chosen felony murder. Prosecutors countered that Tex's actions, asking for the gun, holding it cocked, and firing it, showed reckless disregard for life, not mere negligence. Still, the High Court found that the trial judge's refusal to include the manslaughter option was a serious mistake. In June 2022, the Georgia Supreme Court overturned Tex McIver's felony murder and firearm convictions. It was a stunning decision that reopened the entire case. The justices wrote that the jury should have been allowed to consider involuntary manslaughter as an option, especially given McIver's consistent claim that the shooting was unintentional. The ruling didn't erase his guilt, but it meant his case would have to be retried or resolved through a new agreement. The reversal breathed new life into his legal fight. Supporters celebrated the decision as proof that the justice system had recognized an error, while critics said it showed how wealth and privilege still shaped outcomes in high-profile cases. After the ruling, McIver's case went back to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. Prosecutors were left with a choice: retry the case or negotiate a plea. Several years had passed since the shooting. Witnesses had aged and public attention had faded. Danny Joe Carter, the key eyewitness, had already testified multiple times and expressed reluctance to go through another emotional trial. The state also had to weigh the risk of another uncertain verdict. In 2023, quiet negotiations began between both sides. McIver's health had declined, and he had already served several years in prison. The possibility of a plea deal became more realistic, as both sides sought closure. In early 2024, an agreement was reached. Tex McIver appeared in court once again, older and thinner, his hair now fully white. Standing before the judge, he entered a guilty plea to involuntary manslaughter, reckless conduct, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. The courtroom was quieter than it had been during his first trial. There were no television crews this time, no crowd of reporters pushing for front-row seats. The story had lost its spectacle, but not its meaning. McIver spoke softly, acknowledging his responsibility for the chain of events that led to his wife's death. He stopped short of saying it was deliberate, but his plea was a recognition that his actions caused her death, whether or not he intended it. The judge accepted the plea. Tex was sentenced to a combination of time served and probation. Because he had already spent several years in prison since his original conviction, most of his sentence had been effectively completed. He was transferred to the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections to finish the remaining portion of his term before becoming eligible for parole. After serving the required time, the parole board reviewed his record, his age, and the details of the plea. On January 9, 2025, they approved his release. That day, a gray-haired Tex McIver walked out of prison. Cameras waited at the gate, but he said little. Dressed in a plain jacket, he thanked his attorneys quietly and was escorted away. The man who once stood in a courtroom as a symbol of wealth and privilege now looked frail and tired. Reporters noted that he did not show emotion when asked about Diane. He simply said he wanted peace and that his wife's death would stay with him for the rest of his life. For Diane's friends, the outcome was hard to accept. Many believed that justice had been reduced to a compromise. To them, the plea deal felt like a soft landing for a man who had once wielded influence in Georgia's legal circles. But others saw it differently. They believed the case had exposed a flaw in the system, the danger of assuming intent when a lesser charge could fit the facts. In legal circles, the Georgia Supreme Court's decision became a talking point about fairness in criminal trials and how juries should be given every possible option to consider before convicting someone of murder. The McIver case had begun with a single gunshot in a car on a quiet Atlanta night. It ended nearly 9 years later, after courtroom battles, appeals, and a reversal that changed everything. Yet, the central mystery never fully disappeared. Was it truly an accident? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? People who followed the story still argue about that question. Danny Jo Carter has said she believes only Tex and Diane knew what really happened in those few seconds inside the SUV. In the years after his release, McIver's name remained tied to the tragedy. His once polished reputation in the legal community was gone. The McIver home in Buckhead was sold, and Diane's charitable contributions continued through her foundation. Her friends often described her as the victim twice over, first by the bullet, then by the endless public debate that followed her death. To them, she was more than a case headline. She was a woman who worked hard, cared deeply for her friends, and lived a life that deserved better than the way it ended. The case of Tex and Diane McIver remains one of Georgia's most debated courtroom dramas. It has been cited in legal discussions, true crime documentaries, and studies of accidental shootings. Its theme reaches beyond the details of one couple's tragedy. It explores how love, money, and perception can collide in ways that destroy lives. It shows how the justice system wrestles with uncertainty, how one moment of carelessness can blur the line between accident and crime. For Tex McIver, the rest of his life is marked by what happened that night. He may have left prison, but he will never fully escape the shadow of that gunshot. He lives under probation, his freedom limited, his public standing gone. For those who remember Diane, her death stands as a reminder of how quickly trust can shatter, even in the lives of people who seem to have everything. The story ends where it began, in Georgia, under the quiet southern sky. A lawyer, his wife, and a friend driving home from a weekend away. A single moment, a single sound, and a life forever changed. It's the kind of story that lingers because it feels both extraordinary and ordinary at once. It's about power and regret, about how one man's mistake or choice took away the person he loved most, and how even after justice is served, the truth can still remain uncertain. It began as a love story between a bright young lawyer and a charming man she thought she could trust. But behind closed doors, control replaced affection, and fear replaced love. On a quiet night in Edinburgh, their story ended on a cliff, leaving everyone asking, what really happened on Arthur's Seat? Fawzia Javed was a 31-year-old lawyer from Leeds, West Yorkshire, known for her intelligence, warmth, and determination. She had worked hard to build a stable and respectable life. Those who knew her described her as kind, educated, and strong-minded, a woman who valued family, faith, and fairness. In 2020, her life seemed to take a hopeful turn when she met Kashif Anwar, a 29-year-old optical assistant working at Vision Express. At first, he appeared charming and confident. Fawzia met him through her mother, Yasmin Javed, during a visit to the store. Kashif showed interest in Fawzia almost immediately, and what started as a polite friendship soon turned into a relationship that moved quickly toward marriage. By the end of 2020, despite her family's reservations, Fawzia decided to marry him. They wed on December 20th, 2020, surrounded by family. For Fawzia, it was a leap of faith, a belief that love and commitment could build a peaceful future. But within months, her world began to crumble. The man she had trusted started revealing a darker side. Behind closed doors, Kashif became controlling and volatile. He restricted her movements, watched her every action, and criticized how she dressed and who she spoke to. The once pleasant charm was replaced by manipulation and anger. At first, Fawzia tried to make the marriage work. She hoped things would calm down. But Kashif's controlling behavior grew worse. He took her bank cards, accessed her accounts, and demanded to know where she was at all times. He often accused her of disloyalty or disrespect for small things. He isolated her from her friends, discouraged her from visiting her family, and insulted her intelligence. The emotional abuse turned physical. There were incidents where he shoved and slapped her, followed by apologies that meant little. Fawzia's mother, Yasmin, noticed the change in her daughter's voice and behavior. Fawzia became quieter, more cautious, and fearful. Eventually, she confided in her mother that Kashif was not the man she thought he was. She described how he would shout, threaten, and control her every move. Yasmin urged her to leave him, but Fawzia hesitated. She still hoped that he might change, and she was also scared. Despite her fear, Fawzia began to gather evidence of the abuse. She recorded some of their conversations and kept messages where he insulted or threatened her. She wanted a record, just in case things got worse. And they did. Kashif's temper became explosive. He would accuse her of disrespecting him if she disagreed or questioned him. His pride and insecurity were constant triggers. Friends who had seen them together recalled that Kashif often spoke over her, dismissing her opinions and controlling where she sat or who she spoke to. In the summer of 2021, Fawzia discovered she was pregnant. For a brief moment, she thought it might change things, that becoming parents could soften Kashif and make him more caring. But instead, the abuse intensified. He continued to control her, now using her pregnancy to tighten his hold. He insisted that she needed him and couldn't manage alone. At one point, he even took money from her personal savings, claiming he needed it for their future. By mid-2021, Fawzia had had enough. She decided to leave him and began making plans to move back in with her parents. She told her mother that she was filing for divorce. She wanted to raise her child in a safe and loving home, far away from Kashif's control. She had started documenting his behavior carefully, something that would later become crucial in the trial. But Kashif sensed her growing distance. He begged her to stay, alternating between promises of change and threats. In late August 2021, Kashif suggested a trip to Edinburgh. He told her it would be a chance for them to talk, to clear the air, and start over. Fawzia was hesitant, but agreed, thinking it might be safer to confront him in a public place and perhaps find closure. She told her family about the trip, though her mother felt uneasy. Yasmin sensed something wrong, but couldn't stop her daughter from going. On September 2, 2021, the couple arrived in Edinburgh. They checked into a hotel and spent the afternoon in the city. Witnesses later recalled seeing them together at St. Andrew Square, appearing quiet and distant rather than affectionate. Around evening, they walked toward Arthur's Seat, a well-known hill in Holyrood Park that overlooks the city. The sun was setting, and the area was less crowded. Fawzia was visibly pregnant, about 17 weeks along. She carried herself carefully, moving slowly up the path. As they climbed, an argument broke out. People nearby heard raised voices. Fawzia's tone was calm but firm, while Kashif sounded angry and agitated. It wasn't clear what they were arguing about, but witnesses later described seeing her look frightened and him pacing aggressively. One couple walking down the path remembered her saying something like, "You promised to stop this." Moments later, the argument seemed to quiet down, and the couple continued walking. But when the two reached a more secluded area of the path, away from sight, the situation escalated. What exactly happened in those last few minutes is known only through Kashif's actions and Fawzia's final words. At some point, he pushed her. She fell about 50 feet down a steep slope. The impact was devastating. Passers-by heard a scream and rushed to help. They found her lying at the foot of the cliff, gravely injured but conscious for a short time. Witnesses who reached her said she was in pain and terrified. One recalled her struggling to speak, but clearly saying, "Don't let my husband near me. He pushed me." Those were her last words. Emergency services were called immediately, but despite efforts to save her, she died at the scene. Her unborn child did not survive. When police arrived, they found Kashif nearby, standing on the path, claiming it was an accident. He said she slipped, but officers noted his calm demeanor and lack of urgency. He didn't attempt to go down to help her, nor did he call for assistance himself. He was arrested that night on suspicion of murder. Back in Leeds, Yasmin received the devastating news. Her daughter was gone, and with her, the grandchild she had been waiting to meet. The shock was unbearable. She knew her daughter had been afraid, but never imagined it would end like this. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the evidence. Fawzia's phone held recordings of verbal abuse, messages that revealed manipulation and threats, and notes about incidents she had endured. These became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Witnesses confirmed the argument on the hill, and her dying statement left no doubt about who was responsible. Kashif Anwar was charged with her murder. The case drew national attention, not just for its brutality, but for what it represented, a tragic reminder of how coercive control can escalate into fatal violence. The community in Leeds and Edinburgh mourned the loss of a woman whose life had been filled with promise. When the police took Kashif Anwar into custody on the night of September 2, 2021, his behavior immediately raised suspicion. He appeared composed, not shocked or grief-stricken. Officers noted how he tried to maintain calm, insisting that Fawzia had lost her footing and slipped. But the evidence at the scene told a different story. The terrain where she fell was uneven, but not dangerously steep, and witnesses described seeing them arguing before she went over. More importantly, the words that Fawzia managed to say before dying, "Don't let my husband near me, he pushed me," carried enormous weight. In any investigation, such a statement is treated with the utmost seriousness. Detectives from Police Scotland began reconstructing the final hours of Fawzia's life. They spoke to hikers and couples who had crossed paths with the pair that evening. Several recalled hearing raised voices, describing the argument as tense and emotional. One woman mentioned that Fawzia sounded scared, not angry. Others noticed that Kashif looked furious, his hands gesturing sharply as he spoke. The last known sighting before the fall placed them near a bend of the path that opened onto a drop. Investigators quickly secured the area and collected evidence. Fawzia's belongings, including her phone and bag, were found nearby. Her phone would turn out to be the key piece in understanding what she had endured during her short marriage. When forensic teams examined it, they uncovered voice recordings, messages, and notes that painted a chilling picture of control, threats, and intimidation. These weren't vague complaints. They were detailed accounts of her life under Kashif's constant watch. In one recording, his tone was menacing, telling her that she would regret it if she ever left him. In another, he berated her for speaking to her mother without his permission. By the following morning, the story had reached national news. A pregnant lawyer had fallen to her death from Arthur's seat, and her husband was in custody. As reporters dug deeper, it became clear that this wasn't a tragic accident, but a case of domestic abuse that had reached its deadly end. Friends of Fawzia began speaking publicly about her kindness, her intelligence, and her quiet struggle. Many said they had noticed signs of control, but never imagined he would harm her physically. Her mother, Yasmin, heartbroken but determined, gave her first statement a few days later, saying that her daughter had tried to leave an abusive marriage and deserved justice. In the weeks that followed, the police built a solid case. They pieced together a timeline that began with Fawzia's marriage to Kashif in December 2020 and ended with her death 9 months later. Interviews with family members, neighbors, and colleagues revealed a consistent pattern of abuse. Her coworkers mentioned that she sometimes came to work distracted or upset, often covering it up by saying she was just tired. Her mother recalled receiving tearful phone calls where Fawzia admitted feeling trapped, but feared Kashif's temper if she left. Kashif's own background added to the puzzle. He was described by acquaintances as proud and controlling, someone who demanded respect but couldn't handle criticism. Those close to him noticed that he was easily angered, especially when things didn't go his way. During questioning, he denied being violent, claiming that he and Fawzia argued like any normal couple. But the police had the recordings, and they knew the pattern. His voice shouting threats, her calm tone trying to reason with him. As the investigation continued, evidence of premeditation began to surface. Kashif had suggested the trip to Edinburgh, insisting on going despite Fawzia's reluctance. He had also chosen the time and place, telling her it would help them reconnect. The prosecution later argued that he knew Arthur's seat was secluded and would give him an opportunity to confront her without witnesses. The detail that he didn't call emergency services after she fell strengthened that argument. Instead, it was bystanders who made the call, while he stood a short distance away. The forensic reports confirmed that her injuries were consistent with being pushed, not from an accidental slip. The way her body landed and the position of the rocks suggested a forward motion rather than a stumble. These findings made the defense's story harder to believe. In custody, Kashif continued to insist that it had been an accident. He claimed they were walking close together, that she slipped, and that he had tried to grab her hand but couldn't reach in time. But there was no evidence to back that up. Months passed as the legal process moved forward. A public outpouring of sympathy grew around Fawzia's family. Women's rights groups in the UK, especially in Scotland and Yorkshire, began highlighting her story as a warning about coercive control and domestic violence. Vigils were held in her memory. Flowers and letters were left near Arthur's seat, where she lost her life. Her family described her as a bright young woman whose life had been stolen by cruelty and control. Behind the scenes, prosecutors prepared for trial. They had Fawzia's recorded words, her documented plans for divorce, and multiple witnesses who heard the argument. They also had the final statement she made before dying. For the prosecution, this was not just a case of physical violence. It was the culmination of psychological and emotional abuse that had escalated over time. Kashif was formally charged with murder and remanded in custody. The court set the trial for 2023, delayed in part by backlogs and preparation. During pre-trial hearings, his defense team tried to argue for manslaughter, suggesting that her fall was unintentional and that there was no clear evidence he meant to kill her. The Crown prosecutors rejected that claim, maintaining that his controlling history, the location he chose, and his behavior after the fall all pointed to deliberate intent. Yasmin attended every hearing. Her presence was steady and silent, her face marked with grief but also resolve. She had promised her daughter that she would fight for her, And now that promise became her mission. She shared with investigators the messages her daughter had sent her, describing how frightened she was and how Kashif had been growing more aggressive. Those messages helped build the picture of a man whose need for control had turned dangerous. By the time the trial date approached, the public had already begun to see this case as more than one woman's tragedy. It became part of a larger conversation about the hidden signs of coercive control, how it often starts quietly, how it isolates victims, and how it can end in violence. Fawzia's story echoed many others who had been silenced by partners who appeared loving in public but ruled through fear in private. In Edinburgh, where the case would be heard, there was a sense of tension as the details emerged. The prosecution's evidence list was extensive. Digital files, witness statements, phone records, bank information, and the post-mortem report. The defense's strategy seemed fragile from the start. Still, Kashif remained defiant, confident that he could convince the court it was an accident. As 2023 began, preparations for the trial intensified. Witnesses were summoned, and the court schedule was confirmed. Journalists began revisiting the case, retelling the story of the young lawyer who had fought so hard to escape her abusive marriage. For Yasmin and her family, each mention reopened the wound, but they knew it was necessary. They wanted the truth heard in full, not just for justice, but for every woman who felt trapped, as Fawzia once did. The stage was set for the courtroom battle that would finally expose the full truth about what happened on Arthur's seat. The evidence, the witnesses, and the chilling recordings would soon be heard publicly for the first time. And as the trial neared, the question that remained was whether Kashif Anwar would finally be held accountable for the life he had destroyed and the unborn child who never had a chance to live. In April 2023, almost 2 years after Fawzia Javed's death, the trial of Kashif Anwar began at the High Court in Edinburgh. The courtroom was quiet and tense as the prosecution opened its case. The story that unfolded was one of cruelty, control, and a final act of deliberate violence. Kashif sat in the dock, calm and expressionless, dressed neatly in a suit. Across the room sat Fawzia's mother, Yasmin, holding a small photo of her daughter. Every word spoken in that courtroom carried the weight of her loss. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline of events leading up to the night of September 2nd, 2021. They presented Fawzia as a young lawyer full of potential, who had become trapped in a marriage defined by fear and intimidation. The jury heard that within months of their wedding, Kashif's behavior had turned abusive. He controlled her finances, restricted her contact with friends and family, and constantly criticized her. Evidence from Fawzia's phone recordings captured the reality of their relationship, his angry outbursts, his threats, and her calm but fearful attempts to defuse his rage. One recording was played in court. In it, Kashif's voice was heard shouting at her, accusing her of being disrespectful and ungrateful. His tone was cold and domineering. Another recording captured him warning her that she would pay the price if she ever left him. These audio clips filled the courtroom with an uncomfortable silence. The jurors listened closely, hearing the kind of abuse that often stays hidden behind closed doors. Witnesses took the stand to describe what they saw that night on Arthur's seat. A couple recalled hearing the argument from a distance and noticing that Fawzia looked frightened. They testified that she tried to walk ahead, but he kept pulling her back to talk. A hiker who was nearby said he heard a scream, then silence, before people rushed to help. The prosecution emphasized Fawzia's dying words to those who reached her. "Don't let my husband near me, he pushed me." The Crown argued that those words were the clearest and most powerful evidence of what truly happened. The medical examiner testified next, explaining that her injuries were consistent with being pushed. The direction of her fall, the location of the impact, and the slope of the terrain did not match Kashif's claim that she simply slipped. The court also heard that Kashif did not attempt to go down to her or call for help. Instead, he stood apart while bystanders tried to save her. This lack of reaction, the prosecution said, showed that he had no concern for her life. The defense tried to counter by suggesting that the push could have been accidental, or that she might have stumbled during an argument. Kashif took the stand, maintaining that he never meant to hurt her. He said they had gone to Edinburgh to reconcile, and that he loved her deeply. He described her fall as a tragic accident, insisting that he reached for her but couldn't grab her in time. Yet his version of events conflicted with every piece of evidence the jury had seen and heard. Prosecutor Alex Prentice, KC, pressed him hard, questioning his inconsistencies. Why had he not called emergency services? Why did he not comfort her after the fall? Why had she told witnesses that he pushed her? Kashif avoided direct answers, often saying he was in shock or confused. But his calm demeanor during the arrest and his lack of effort to help undermine those excuses. The prosecution reminded the jury that Fawzia had already documented her fear of him and had been planning to leave. The trip to Edinburgh, they argued, was his opportunity to regain control, and when she refused to give in, he made the fatal decision. When the closing arguments ended, the courtroom was still. The jury retired to deliberate. It took them only a short time to reach a verdict. On April 6, 2023, Kashif Anwar was found guilty of murdering his wife, Fawzia Javed. The judge, Lord Beckett, addressed him directly during sentencing. He said Kashif had shown no genuine remorse and had deliberately chosen a secluded spot to confront and kill his wife. He sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 20 years before he could be considered for parole. The words were measured and final, marking the end of a long and painful road to justice. In court, Yasmin wept quietly as the verdict was read. Later, she told reporters that while no sentence could bring back her daughter, justice had finally been done. She spoke about Fawzia's strength, her courage to record and report the abuse, and her bravery even in her last moments. Those final words, naming her killer, ensured that the truth would not be buried with her. Outside the courtroom, the case drew national attention once again. Advocates for women's safety called for stronger awareness around coercive control and domestic abuse. Fawzia's story became part of a broader call for change, reminding society how emotional and psychological abuse can escalate into lethal violence. She had done everything she could, spoken up, gathered evidence, planned to leave, and still became a victim of the man who refused to let her go. For Yasmin and the rest of Fawzia's family, the pain remains, but her legacy endures. They continue to speak about her case, hoping it will help others recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Fawzia's life, though short, now stands as a symbol of courage and truth, a reminder that every victim's voice matters, and that even in her final breath, she refused to stay silent.